Right. Hello, everyone. Hope you all had a good reading week, and welcome to Lecture 6 in the Politics of Religion. In the previous lecture, we were looking at some of the core factors involved in the transmission of religion, and a little bit about the origins, potential origins at least, of religion. And the purpose of this lecture is to look at some of the core factors involved in the decline of religion. And this brings us to a thing called secularisation. Oops, hang on a second, my slides are gone funny here. What's going on there? And this is the idea that religion in various ways is in decline, and it's one of the foundational themes of the social sciences. We've already seen, at a couple of points already in the module, that religion has often been regarded as something of a backwards force, something that was destined to die out as human society advanced in various different ways. We see this, for example, in respect of people like Karl Marx, when we were talking about social control theory, the view that religion was just sort of epiphenomena of capitalist society, and that when the glorious communist revolution arrived, then religion would disappear. And we also see this in the conflict thesis. The idea that the battle between science and religion, and the idea here from some quarters is that as science advances, then religion will be sort of banished to the god of the gaps, and then will increasingly sort of disappear. This view is also held by the guy on the top left, who you might not recognise, but he's a chap called Auguste Comte, and he is often regarded as being the father of sociology, and he considered religion to be an outmoded system that would disappear again as society advanced. But interestingly, he wanted to replace it with what he called a religion of humanity. And this was the idea that people would then worship sort of extremely intelligent figures, or extremely important people, figures in art and literature and so on and so forth. It never really got going, although for some reason I don't know what the answer to this is. It was quite popular for a while in France and Brazil. But anyway, it never really worked. But the key point here is that this idea of secularisation, the idea that religion is in decline and will at some point disappear, was there right at the beginning of the social sciences. And it's kind of ingrained into the very ideas of the social sciences and how they initially saw the world. And as we know, of course, this hasn't happened. So does this mean that these assumptions around secularisation were wrong? Well, this is what I'm going to look at today, and this is the plan. First of all, I'm going to run through the classical secularisation thesis, with the initial kind of theories to explain religion and religious decline. Then I'm going to look at some of the evidence for and against this claim. Then, thirdly, I'm going to talk about a thing called the neo-secularisation thesis, which is a sort of revised and updated version of it. And then finally, I'm going to talk a bit about some criticisms of this approach as well. So it's all pretty straightforward stuff. And we begin then with secularisation. And the first thing I want you all to burn into your brains is that it's not the same thing as secularism. And I say this every year. And every year I get essays which have secularisation and secularism conflated. So just really, really quickly, secularism is the political relationship between the state and religion, right? Secularism would be the view that they should be separate, which we'll talk about this obviously in a couple of weeks. Secularisation is the argument that religion will decline. So these are separate things. Now they'll be slightly technical, they are obviously connected, because if a society has religious institutions and then it secularises, so the state becomes separate from religion and religion loses power, obviously you can say religion in that sense has declined, right? So they can be connected, but not necessarily, right? They are different things. Just bear that in mind, and for my own sanity, that would be great. Thank you very much. So secularisation generally then refers to a process of decline. And in one respect, this seems fairly straightforward, right? You'd say, well, okay, religion declining, that seems pretty obvious, fine. But once you think about it, it's a bit more complicated than that. It's not at all straightforward. Because, well, the first thing here, which you've mentioned before, is this idea of the three Bs. right? The different dimensions of religiosity, which is the way in which people can be religious. And typically this breaks down into beliefs, belonging, and behaviour. And so we can think about secularisation on each of these levels, right? If people lose their beliefs, that would be a sign of religious decline. If a society had declining membership figures for religion, that would be a sign of decline. If people had loss of behaviour, so people were no longer taking part in religious rituals, if they weren't praying as frequently, if they were reading holy text less frequently, that would also be a sign of secularisation. But it can mean other things as well, right? As I previously just mentioned a second ago, it can also refer to the political influence of religious institutions. So the three Bs could stay exactly the same, right? But the religious institutions could lose power and influence in a society, and that would also be secularisation. But it could also refer to a decline in the social and cultural values of religion. Or it could also refer to, you'll sometimes find this in the literature, trust in religious authorities. There are various other things as well, which I'm not going to sort of bore you about now, but the basic point here is that there are lots of different ways in which secularisation can happen. And to compound this, not all of these things may happen at the same time, or in the same speed, or even be caused by the same factors. So this idea then of religion being in decline, which appears at first blush to be very, very obvious and straightforward, once you then start to go through, well, okay, what would that actually look like, starts to become insanely complicated very, very quickly. So just conceptualising secularisation, let alone measuring it, with all the problems that we have around data collection and everything else, is trickier than it first appears. Now, classical secularisation theorists, people like Peter Berger, or Brian Wilson, David Martin, for example, argued that the core processes behind religious decline were linked to modernity. And this was the basic idea that as societies became more economically and technologically developed, then religion would decline. And there were various reasons for this. And we're going to go through just some of them now. I'm not going to go through all of them because, again, as I've just kind of intimated, there's quite a lot going on. But these are some of the main ones. So first of all, we have, we saw this, didn't we, with the conflict thesis, right? This is the basic claim. As science explains more and more aspects of the world, as scientific knowledge develops, this drives religion back into this God of the gaps position. And as society becomes increasingly organised around rational principles and based on scientific technologies, right? Every single person now has a smartphone. We all use computers all the time. Our lives are kind of spent on the internet, right? Science, to that extent, has kind of taken over huge swathes of our life. Then the argument is that the plausibility structure of religion, this is the idea that religion has a credible way of explaining and accounting for the world, starts to dissolve, right? Science has a kind of acid effect on religion in that way. And so religion becomes increasingly called into question. So that's one way in which secularisation can happen. A second factor is the growth of pluralism and diversity. Now, this is an interesting claim because if you remember, earlier in the module, we're talking about the different theoretical perspectives on religion, right? And one of these was the religious markets approach, this rational choice way of examining religion. And the argument there is that pluralism and diversity increases religiosity, right? Because if you have a society where you have an open and free religious market, and you have lots of religious entrepreneurs out there competing for people, trying to persuade people to believe and bring them in, then this competitive dynamic, so the argument goes, leads to increased levels of religiosity. The argument from secularisation, however, is that it has the opposite effect. So increased pluralism and diversity from this perspective leads to a decline of religion for similar reasons to the points I've just mentioned, right? Around the plausibility structure of religious beliefs. If you live in a society where there's basically just one religion, right? It's just a homogenous religious view, maybe enforced by the state. Everybody you know has the same religion. Everywhere you go, it's the same religion. It's not going to be surprising if you yourself would then turn out to have the same religion. But if you live in a society where there's lots of different religions on offer, or non-religious views too on offer, you have a greater kind of option to take up or not take up religion, as the case may be, then this has the effect of relativizing religious beliefs. Because it then has the effect of people going around thinking, well, my religion is the one true religion, but actually there's all these other religions, right? And I meet people from these other religions, and they seem okay, right? They're not like terrible people. This, again, has a similar corrosive effect on religious beliefs. So the argument goes. And once people then reach the point that maybe their religion isn't necessarily the one true religion, it's a sort of short hop to thinking, well, maybe it's not true at all. So that would be the second key factor. The third one is known as functional differentiation, which is a horrible phrase for something that isn't actually as difficult as you might think. The essential argument here is that modernity reshapes the organizational structures of society around things like capitalism, industrialization, principles of rationality, which I mentioned a minute ago, ideas of democracy. All of these things have tremendous transformative effects on how society works. And so when these dynamics kick in, the various spheres of social life, like law or education or politics or the economy, they all take on their own increasingly autonomous dynamics with their own logics, their own internal processes, right? Previously, all of these things would be kind of smooshed together in a big undifferentiated mass. But as capitalism, industrialization, the rise of the democratic state kicks in, all of these things then start to have their own particular laws and logics to them. Now, you might be thinking, well, you just said this was going to be straightforward. What the hell are you talking about? Let me give you an example of what this means in practice. Religious organizations used to play a central role in providing all kinds of social and welfare services, like health and education. But as modernity progresses, the state, the democratic, industrialized state, expands to take on these functions for itself. So education becomes provided by schools and universities, healthcare becomes provided by hospitals. And so one effect of this is that individual people, in the course of their day-to-day lives, have less contact with religious organizations. And when they have less contact with religious organizations, then the religious hold over their daily life declines. The influence of religious institutions over society starts to fall away. So functional differentiation also, it is argued, leads to secularisation. And the final factor I want to mention here is socialisation. Now, we discussed this in the previous lecture when we were talking about the role of, peer groups and your families and which country you're born in and all that kind of stuff. And broadly speaking, it's a similar kind of process here, but the process sort of works the other way. So one of the key mechanisms involved in this, in terms of secularisation, is called a process of intergenerational decline. And what this basically means is, once a society starts to lose religion, then it has a kind of snowball effect, right? Because the parents who are not religious, or even if they're just not, they don't lose religion, but they just don't go to church anymore. It's what becomes a kind of, I think David Vose described this as fuzzy fidelity. People who might kind of believe now and again, but not really and not particularly strongly, and they don't have, religion isn't very important to them, right? That's usually the kind of first step. Because going from one, religious to non-religious is not normally like flipping a switch. Most people kind of go through the kind of grey area in between, right? Once you're in that grey area and you're having children, well, if you're not particularly inclined to go to a place of worship, then you're not going to bother, and you're not going to raise your children to be religious. And so your children will grow up to be less religious than you, and then when they have children, their children will be less religious than they were. And so it has this kind of ratchet effect across society, which means that each successive generation becomes progressively less religious than the one before. Now, those are some of the main dynamics. As I said, there are others too, but those are sort of the big ones. But one important thing just to note before I press on here is just to sort of underline this, because this sort of makes the point that the secularisation thesis is not actually a single thesis at all. There is no overarching secularisation theory. what we have is a collection of different ideas, different approaches, different perspectives, different theories on how religion declines. And so you might take the view, as Gorski notes here, that rather than speaking of a secularization theory, it might be better to speak of a secularization paradigm, a sort of general worldview that includes within it a whole bunch of different but related theoretical perspectives. Okay, so where does this leave us then? What do we know about the basic claim here? Because all of these things will come at it from a different viewpoint, right? But they're basically all saying the same thing in terms of religious decline. They have different ways of getting there, but the bottom line is basically the same. Religion is on its way out. So what does the evidence tell us about this? Well, those of you who hate statistics, and I wouldn't necessarily blame you for that, should look away for the next few minutes. I mean, you won't learn anything, but you might have an easier time with it. But unfortunately, I'm going to have to give you some stats. There's no way around this, right? In order to show how religion declines, I have to kind of give you numbers and figures. It's just the way it is. So, here we go. Supporters of the secularization paradigm normally focus on measurable variables. Things like the 3 Bs I mentioned a few minutes ago, right? Beliefs, belonging, behaviour, looking at membership figures, looking at how frequently people do things, asking them questions and taking surveys about the kinds of stuff they believe. And typically, a lot of the measurements here come from the global north, like Western Europe, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. Not the United States. Well, yes, the United States, but the United States is generally seen to be an exception to secularization for reasons that I'll come on to in a few minutes. So this is the general approach. And as you can see from this table, which is from Norris and Inglehart, church attendance as a proportion of the adult population fell significantly across Western Europe throughout the post-war period. Now, of course, you probably can't see that very well because it's just a stream of numbers. So because I had too much time on my hands, I put this in graph form for you. And as you can see, this is the general trajectory. It's not always even. There are some bumps in the road. There is the occasional reversal here and there. But the general trend in Western Europe throughout the post-war period is one of steady decline. This is only going one way, right? It's heading in a downward direction. Okay, here are some more graphs. These are from Berkshire, which is on the reading list, also showing attendance levels across the post-war period to the end of the last century. Again, there are some jitters here and there. Some countries have more uneven positions. Romania and Ukraine, for example, which if you look at, where are they? The top right. So Romania would be the green line and Ukraine would be the sort of dark blue line. They're the most religious countries in Europe. And you can also see, if you can find them on here, some countries like France, Denmark and Sweden tend to have stabilised. So religion has fallen and then kind of levelled off, like it's not really dropping anymore. So you do get some different patterns here. But the overall trend in most countries and the overall trend for the region as a whole is down. These trends are also apparent in the UK. These are figures from a 2018 poll from British Social Attitudes, which doesn't ask questions about religion every single time. So you might be thinking, well, 2018 was a few years ago, like where are the latest figures? These are the latest figures, right? They only take a snapshot every now and again, or at least these are the latest figures I'm aware of. If you find more up-to-date ones, please let me know. But as you can see, this was asking people how they identified from between 1983 and 2017. The proportion of adults describing themselves as Christian dropped off from 2/3 to 2/5. The proportion identified with non-religion rose from 31% to 53%, making the non-religious population the majority in the UK. And there are similar results in other countries. These are my penultimate stats for this section. For those of you who really don't like stats. In Canada, as you can see, the proportion of adults describing themselves as having no religion grew from just 4% in 1971 to 35% by 2021. In Australia, these were figures from the 2016 census, found that no religion had more than doubled, going from 16% at the turn of the century to 39% while the proportion describing themselves identifying as Christian had halved from 1966, from 44% to 88%. In New Zealand, it's a similar thing. The proportion identifying as having no religion grew from 30% to 48% from 2001 to 2018. The final stats I'm going to give you for this section, these are all obviously, from the global north. You do find similar patterns in other parts of the world. East Asia is quite interesting in this respect because East Asia has the highest rates of religious disaffiliation in the world. And religious disaffiliation means leaving your religion, right? Now, we have to kind of be careful with this because, as we know, because we've talked about it in class, spiritual practices in East Asia, things like ancestor worship, for example, or belief in spirits of some kind, is still quite high. So just because people are leaving their religion does not necessarily mean they're all becoming atheists, right? And as we know, again, because we spoke about this before, the category of no religion includes a whole bunch of other things, right? People who might be not a member of a religion, but they might still identify as being spiritual in some way. So the category of no religion doesn't necessarily mean complete wipeout for religion, but nevertheless, these are figures for people in parts of East Asia who had lost their religion. This is 37% of adults in Hong Kong said that since they were a child, they had left their religion. Figure from South Korea was 35%, in Taiwan it was 22%, Japan 21%. The final point to note here, this is in the evidence for section still. It's not figures though, you'll be glad to know. Just a final sort of observation really. Studies have also found, there's one on the reading list by Corcoran, for example, if you're interested in this particular issue, is that secularisation doesn't just affect religion, but it affects all kinds of sort of tangential and associated beliefs. It has effects on supernatural and paranormal beliefs across society. These would be things like beliefs in gods, angels, demons, psychic powers, magic, luck. All of that stuff also declines as secularisation kicks in. Okay, so that would be, if I was a lawyer, I would kind of rest my case at this point and I'd go and have a cup of tea, right? This would be like part one of the evidence for secularisation. Critics of secularisation, though, have got a number of interesting objections to all of this. And the first one is that the secularisation paradigm is flawed on methodological grounds. So the idea here is that, the classical secularisation will look at things like falling attendances, declining memberships, and they'll say that shows that religion, is in decline, right? But critics of the secularisation paradigm will say that doesn't necessarily mean that people are losing their religion. As Grace Davey has put it, she has a thing called the believing without belonging hypothesis. And this is the claim, or her argument, was that declining attendances and membership were part of a general decline across Western society of civic membership as a whole. So it's not that people are necessarily losing religion, it's just that people don't join things anymore. People don't join political parties, they don't join trade unions, they don't join sports clubs. Western society is becoming increasingly atomised, and this idea that there are civic activities that people will sign up to is just being eroded across the board. And of course, religious institutions are being caught up in that other process. So it's not necessarily targeted at religion, it's sort of a general civic problem. And so one argument that we find here is that religion isn't necessarily dying out, but it's changing form. And this is the claim that people might be losing institutionalized religion, but what's actually happening is they're becoming increasingly spiritual but not religious. And there is some evidence to support this. I will give you a couple of tables here. This is the first one is from Pew, which found that the proportion of Americans who identify themselves as being spiritual rose from 19% to 27% in the 5 years from 2012 to 2017. This is obviously the blue line in the middle, spiritual but not religious, increasing. And we also find evidence from this in the UK. Despite the fact that no religion is now the majority, we still find significant parts of the population saying that there is something there. There is some kind of higher power. So, for example, let me direct your attention to the faint green block in the top line. This is the total proportion of adults in the UK who say they don't believe in God, but they believe that there's some kind of spiritual higher power. A fifth of all adults would identify like that. And then if we add in the green line to the right of that, the sort of thicker green block, which is I don't believe, sorry, I've completely got this wrong, haven't I? This would be 32%. The other one would be, which is it? Yes, so if you say I believe in a God, which would be my mistake, the blue line to the left, I believe in God. And if we join that with the proportion who says they don't believe in God, but they believe in something, then you still get 52% of the population, which is a majority. So a lot of these figures, depends how you measure it, depends how you ask the question and so on, but there is still a significant proportion of the adult population that believes in religion or something very much like it. So methodologically then, the secularisation thesis has a problem. It doesn't necessarily mean that declining religion in terms of the measurements means what supporters of secularisation think it means. The second problem is the secularisation paradigm has an ethnocentric dimension to it. And the claim here is that it's biased towards certain types of religion. All of this, by the way, goes back to the stuff we talked about right at the beginning of the module about how can religion be defined, and is this idea of religion a Western-centric concept, right? This plugs directly in to all of that. Because the idea here then is that if you're going to measure religiosity, so the question would be for secularisation, how the hell do you measure it, right? And if the answer to that is, well, what we're going to do is we're going to look at membership and we're going to look at attendance, and that's going to be the bar by which we judge whether or not religion is in decline. Well, okay, fine. That works for some religions, works for Christianity maybe, works for Islam, might work for Judaism. It's going to work for the Abrahamic religions, right, where people, as a general rule, will turn up to stuff because that's part of what those religions do. But it's not going to work for religions that don't have that dimension to it. It's not going to work, for Buddhism, for example, or Shintoism, or the various folk religions around the world, right? Measuring secularization like that is not going to pick up the dynamics of those religions. Critics will also point out that much of the data that we have on secularization comes from, as I said earlier, the global north, typically Western Europe, and that other parts of the world still have very high levels of religiosity. Typically, the general argument here is that religion has declined in Western Europe, religion has declined in Latin America, religion has declined in parts of the Soviet bloc, but not everywhere. But in sub-Saharan Africa and in the Muslim world, religion remains extremely high, remains the dominant perspective, right? Despite the fact that in some parts of those blocs, we have widespread and high levels of modernization. So the theory doesn't necessarily work, right? Think of Dubai, for example, right? United Arab Emirates, high levels, parts of Saudi Arabia, highly modernized, but also extremely religious. So does secularization work? And of course, there's also the United States of America. This is often flagged as being an exception to the secularization paradigm because, despite appearances now and again, it is a highly modernized, technologically advanced society, and yet is, of course, at the same time, extremely religious. So does this disprove the ideas around secularization? A third problem with the secularization paradigm is it's called the temporal problem, or sometimes referred to as the golden age problem. And this refers to the sort of obvious fact, which is that if you're saying religion has declined, there must have been a point in the past where it's higher than it is now. There had to have been a point in the past for it to have declined from. And in order to make that argument, that requires us to know what religion was like in the past. And this is a problem because, okay, we can get data from the post-war period, right? Because people started counting stuff. But if we go back 200, 300 years, 500 years, like, do we know what was going on then? I mean, we might think we know. We might kind of go, well, religion, you know, the church was really powerful in Europe. Everybody was clearly religious. Were they? Were they really? I mean, some historians will doubt this. Some historians will say, yes, they were. The point being that we don't have any kind of agreed upon consensus around this, and we certainly don't have any sort of reliable data that we can use to compare directly to the data we have today. Anything we might have, you know, if we kind of plug it into our models, it's like comparing apples and oranges. So this also creates a problem for secularization theory because we don't really know what religion was doing in the past. And so, taking these various problems together then, some people have argued that, you know, secularization theory should just be junked. It's useless. We should get rid of it. Peter Berger, who was one of the initial exponents of the secularization paradigm, he was one of the most famous secularization theorists, came to the view during the 1980s that actually it was rubbish. Now, as you can see, this is his very famous quote. He said, "The world today, with some exceptions, is as furiously religious as it ever was." And as Rodney Stark and Roger Fink, who you will know, of course, from the religious markets approach, say, secularization, let's just chuck it in the graveyard of failed theories. It does not work. Okay, so if I was the lawyer for the other side, now I would go and get a cup of tea and let the other person come back and have their go. So this is, of course, what I'm going to do, right? This is not necessarily the end of the story. And the secularization supporters obviously have comebacks to this. So here are some of them. The first refers to this idea that religion is not declining but changing form. And one obvious problem with this is that it's very difficult to measure. When somebody says, I'm spiritual but not religious, it's very difficult to measure that because there's no clear definition on what spirituality actually means. And it's not clear that when people say they're spiritual, they're actually talking about the same thing. You could have 10 people describe themselves as being spiritual in different ways, and there would be very little common ground between them. So when you're measuring this stuff, it's not at all clear that you're measuring the same thing. When you see surveys of people saying, I'm spiritual but not religious, okay, but what exactly do they believe? What exactly is being captured with this? And there's no formal organisations for people to join. You can't go and join the spiritual society, right? More so when you get involved with New Age spirituality, which we'll talk about in a few weeks. There's no central organisation. You can't get a membership card for this, right? So it's very, very difficult to measure the numbers of people who agree with these particular worldviews. So that's one problem. A second response from the supporters of secularization is that so this is the idea that the United States is some kind of exception, right? The United States is modernized and it's still highly religious, so that disproves secularization theory. The problem we have with this is that evidence shows that the United States is in fact secularizing. It's secularizing at a slower pace than Western Europe, and there is a lag, but it's still going through the process of secularization. As you can see here, some figures from Pew. The proportion of adults in the US describing themselves as Christian, this is the line at the top, fell from 78% to 65% from 2007 to 2019, and the proportion describing themselves or identifying with no religion, this would be the religiously unaffiliated, or the nuns, as they're called in the literature, this is the line at the bottom, grew from 16% to 26%. In fact, the latest survey from Pew puts it even higher at this. It's now about 28%. Although that has gone down slightly. It got to about a third, and then it's kind of dropped off a little bit. But this, interestingly, makes the nuns the single largest religious group in the United States. 28% of people identify as being non-religious. The proportion of Catholics is 23%. Evangelical Protestants are at 24%. And by the way, this came out just Sorry, I've completely messed my slides up on this other one. Let me skip through those. This came out literally 3 or 4 days ago. Data from Gallup, as you can see here. This is looking at the last 10 years and how much religion has declined in various societies. The question they were asking was, how important is religion to you in your daily life? And for the United States, where is it here? It's fallen from 66% to 49%. This is the biggest 10-year drop ever measured by Gallup in the OECD. So secularization is happening in the United States. The idea that the US is some kind of exception to the theory is not borne out by the evidence. Supporters of secularization also have come back with new ideas about how it works. So, okay, critics have got a point when you talk about some of the classical secularization ideas, right? This claim that modernity does these various things, and these, science and functional differentiation and all the rest of it. Okay, it might not necessarily work in the way that people had once imagined. So there is a revised version on the table. This is sometimes called the neo-secularization thesis, comes from Pippo Norris and Ronald Inglehart, and this is the idea that the central driver for secularization is existential insecurity. This is the key claim. So the idea is that existential insecurity drives people to be religious. So if you grow up in a part of the world, if you grow up in an environment where it's extremely unstable, high levels of poverty, high levels of crime, the state doesn't really function very well. I'm describing the UK, aren't I? If you've got that kind of situation, things just don't work anymore, society seems to be falling apart, you might have wars or civil wars and so on chucked into the mix, then people are likely to turn to religion as a way of giving them a sense of control over their environment. This is Burrhus Skinner and his pigeons. Remember his superstitious pigeons trying to create the idea that they could control their environment? This is basically, although on a much more sophisticated and elaborate scale, what religion does according to this theory. Gives people a sense, a feeling that there's an order to the universe, that they have some kind of control over their life. It's very similar to terror management theory, right? This creates a psychological mechanism for control. And so conversely then, the argument is that people who grow up in societies where they have high levels of existential security, societies that function properly, have a reasonable welfare state and all the rest of it, no wars, no disasters and so on, are less likely to take up religion, right? Are more likely to go the other way. Now, the way in which Norris and Inglehart measure this is by looking at figures from human development indices, which combines the whole thing like child mortality rates, serious crime, corruption, poverty, and they put it all together into this statistical model. And what they find is this. You can basically divide societies up into 3 different types. You've got agrarian societies, which have the highest dependency on nature. Right? If it doesn't rain, your crops don't grow, you starve. It's a very, very simple equation, right? It has the lowest levels of security, and it has the highest levels of religiosity. Then we have industrialized societies, which give people greater control over their environment. Increased ideas of rationality in science, for example. These societies then experience a decline of religion. And then we get finally to post-industrial societies, which have the highest levels of security and the lowest levels of traditional religious beliefs. However, something interesting happens in post-industrial societies, because the thing is, when people become so secure they don't need to worry about the day-to-day living, they start to fret about other things, right? Because this is what people do. They start to worry about the meaning of life. Like, okay, my fridge is full, I don't need to worry about anything. The paychecks are coming in quite regularly. I've got my Xbox, I could play on that every single night. All my life is but I kind of wake up at 4 o'clock in the morning with this gnawing, dread in my soul. What is the purpose of everything? You start to find that in post-industrial societies. And that's when you start to get the growth of the spiritual but not religious category. Let me just give you some quick stats on this. These are figures taken from World Values Survey data, dividing up, as I've just explained, agrarian, industrial, and post-industrial if you look at the religious participation, this is the line at the top. It basically goes down in the way I just explained. Agrarian societies are the highest, then it drops, post-industrial at the bottom. If you look at belief in God, this would be the line at the bottom. It has the same pattern, highest in agrarian societies and then declining through industrial and post-industrial societies. But if you look at the kind of one in the middle, belief in life after death, this is a hint that the spiritual but not religious effect is happening, right? 55% of people in agrarian societies say they believe in life after death, 44% in industrial societies, and then it kind of bounces back. Post-industrial societies up to 49%. And there is, just to give you some, very, very quickly, some more up-to-date data, because I think the Norris and Inglehart ones now are sort of 20 years old. These are figures from Ronald Inglehart's analysis from just a few years ago. This is tracking people who do not believe in God and the proportion of adults in high-income societies. And as you can see, in 1981, this was around about 20% of people in high-income societies did not believe in God. Now, by 2018, it's basically doubled. So the argument is high-income societies, safer, wealthier, more secure, give people more control over their lives, religion declines. This is basically the existential security thesis at work. I'm going to quickly skip over this one just because I'll do it really, really quickly. I'm just running out of time. This is also shows been global data, by the way. The slides are all up. You can kind of go and grab this for yourself. This is data from Gallup looking at the relationship between GDP and belief, the people who say that religion is important to them. And there is a direct correlation. The red line at the bottom, which has the lowest proportion of people saying religion is important to them, are the high-income countries. And as you go up the scales, these are countries becoming less wealthier. So by the time you get to the yellow line at the top, these are the poorest countries in the world. They have the highest levels of people saying religion is important in their lives. The really interesting thing about this, by the way, is that we also find this within societies. And so this is, if you ask people, I mean, this might not be a perfect measurement of it, but if you ask people, you know, is God necessary for morality? And if we accept that as being some kind of measure of how important they view religion, these figures are showing you the differences within different societies from people in different income categories. So in the United States, for example, 56% of people in the lower income category say God is needed for morality, but just a third of people in the higher income category will say the same thing. And it's the same pattern across different countries. This existential security thing doesn't work just between countries, it also works within countries. And this is possibly what explains the high levels of religiosity in the United States. The United States, highly modernized, technologically developed society, but has enormous levels of social inequality, a very, very basic welfare state, and increasingly being stripped away. So the levels of existential insecurity in the United States are going to be far higher than they are in comparable countries in Western Europe, like Sweden, Denmark, Germany, for example, where they have welfare states and greater social service provision. So let me just quickly skip then to the critics again. Let's give the final say to the critics. So we've kind of gone through two waves of people supporting secularization theory. Critics of this will still don't, none of this is a sort of checkmate, right? There are always arguments on both sides. And so I'm not presenting any of this to you as this is how you should look at it, right? I'm giving you the evidence for and the evidence against. Critics of the neo-secularization approach will say all of this sounds fine. How do we measure existential insecurity, right? There's no, because people, this is by definition a subjective thing, right? And people may feel differently about their situation. You could be a very, very wealthy person, still feel incredibly secure. I'd like to test that theory out, but I can imagine that it's true, right? Conversely, you might be somebody living in a low-income bracket but feel very, very secure in your life because you have, a wide circle of family and friends, and you have everything figured out, and, your life is pretty much as you expect it to be. So this idea of existential insecurity is trying to capture something subjective, and yes, human development indices might be a good way of doing that, but it's not going to fit everybody. And as Norris and Inglehart themselves say, this is their quote, they don't have a direct specific measure of existential security. And if that's the basis of your theory, and critics will say you should have a robust, measurable way of assessing this before you go making grand claims about religious decline. So that's one problem with the neo-secularization approach. Second one is that it has a very negative view of religion. This is a bit like terror management theory, right? The idea that it says, well, religion is just there as a comfort blanket to make people feel better about things, And that's quite a negative way of looking at religion. And a lot of religious believers will say that doesn't capture the real, everyday religious experience. Where religion enriches people's lives, it gives them something. It gives them something more than just, I believe in this because life's otherwise terrible, right? And I need to believe in some mythical father figure who's looking out for me. That's not what religion is actually about, according to critics. So they will also say neo-secularization theory has a very pejorative view of religion, and then, the theory is sort of tainted by association. And then, well, one interesting thing with this, it's not necessarily a criticism of it, but I put it on here because it's quite a sort of fascinating mental puzzle. Because classical secularization theory, right? If you remember at the very beginning, I was kind of going, well, this was built into the social sciences. The DNA of the social sciences had this idea that religion was inevitably going to decline, and it would at some point disappear. Well, neo-secularization theory, because the mechanism is based on existential security, there is a mechanism there by which religion could go the other way. Because if religion declines when existential security increases, right? If everyone has welfare states, lots of money, universal basic income, all the needs of life are taken care of, religion will decline. This is the general view. But what happens then if societies become increasingly insecure? What happens if climate change kicks off, right? Or, a zombie apocalypse or something. Would this mean, and then everyone's lives become, like what's going on now? Society collapses, right? The mechanism is there for religion to make a comeback. Now, is there anything that you can think of in the past few years that we can use as a comparable example for this? Well, yeah, right? The COVID pandemic, sorry to remind you about it again. This provided, terrible experience, but theoretically provided a really useful laboratory, no pun intended, and obviously none taken, for measuring this kind of approach, right? Because levels of global insecurity, levels of existential insecurity went up massively during the pandemic. We would then expect, if these ideas are true, that religion would also have made something of a comeback. So did it? Well, this is one, there's quite a lot of studies into this. This is one I'm going to recommend to you on the reading list. This study looked at internet searches around the world throughout different phases of the pandemic, right? So looked for the proportion of people. How often were people looking for things like prayer or, the Bible or Allah or Jesus or spirituality, all these religious terms? Did internet searches for religion go up? And the answer was that yes, they did. They went up quite a bit. But they only went up during the first phase of the pandemic. Second and third phases of the pandemic, no real difference, right? And they only went up, and this is also borne out by other studies, they only really went up in parts of the world that were already highly religious. So countries that had already secularized to a greater or lesser extent, like countries in Western Europe, for example, Australia, Canada, so on and so forth, didn't really see any increase in religiosity at all. But other parts of the world where religion is quite prevalent did see increases in religious search terms. So the situation around neo-secularization and existential insecurity is also more complicated than we might imagine. Anyway, that's it for today. So thanks for coming, as usual. Next week, we're going to be looking at the rise of non-religion, the new atheists, and all of that. So until then, have a good week, and I'll see you all next time out.